Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction. Thank you guys for inviting us here to talk. I completely changed what I was going to talk about. So I'm just going to talk kind of in general about PDA closures, where they are, what we're doing in the States. And then I'm going to focus a lot of this talk on premature PDA closures, because I think we're going to do a lot more of those, and it's kind of one of the ever-changing and newer kind of marketplaces for what we're doing as cath docs. So we're going to review PDAs. We're going to talk a little bit about the devices that are available. I'm going to go through a case example for an older patient and kind of what I do in the cath lab for every single older PDA patient. And then we're going to talk about premature infant PDA closures, and I'm going to run through a case example for that. So just really quickly to touch on, sorry, don't need the stool. What a PDA is. So we know a persistent ductus arteriosus is persistent fetal circulation. We all had those when we were in utero, but a good chunk of us are still walking around with a persistent PDA. What it causes for the older patients is left heart enlargement. And when you start to see that over time, we know that that is bad for your heart and for your lungs and for the worry about creating pulmonary hypertension. Very rarely you can get an episode of endarteritis or endocarditis, infection actually in the PDA, and that's another indication for closing a PDA. Pulmonary hypertension, that's reactive. It's a significant volume burden, but also if you have a reactive pulmonary hypertension or pulmonary bed, you can go ahead and close a PDA in the cath lab. And then what I'll touch on a lot at the end is premature infants with bad lungs that have a hemodynamically significant PDA. And the key is, what is a hemodynamically significant PDA? And I don't know if we have the answer to that at this time. Let's see, do I have a pointer? Oh, yeah. So this is just a case example just to show, you can see significant left heart enlargement. You can see a high velocity PDA, that's all left to right. So this is a patient that would meet indication from my standards to come to the cath lab for a PDA closure. So just really briefly to touch on the types of PDAs. So there's 6 types now, A, B, C, D, E, and F. And the vast majority of our older patients fall in this conical or type A PDA type. This is the type that has a larger aortic ampulla that then tapers down and narrows to their PA side. And then the other group that I think is important to consider is the fetal type PDA. And this is kind of, newer described, but this is patients that have a fetal duct, and I'll touch base on those. So this is the whole list of devices that we kind of have available. A lot of these are taken from other areas of medicine because not everything's approved for pediatric interventions. Coils, so these are just your regular standard cheap old coils that have been around for a long time. The AD01, the Amplatz duct occluder type 1, this is kind of your classic, it's FDA approved for PDA closures. Has a large aortic cap that sits in the ampulla and then tapers narrow. The AD02 is another device that's approved for PDA closures. I've actually never used this personally in a PDA, but I've used it to close muscular VSDs. As opposed to the muscular VSD device, I've actually never used to close a muscular VSD. I've used that to close a PDA. And then you have other devices. You have the Amplatz vascular plug type 2. Other people have used AVP4s. You have microvascular plugs as well. And then you have the KA plug. And then what has come out to the market that is now, again, FDA approved that we're using is the Amplatz Piccolo device. And the Piccolo device is approved for the premature infant population. So this is kind of my, my cath lab approach to all PDAs for patients that, in my mind, I do this in patients that are above 4 kilos. And I do this because the risk of something bad happening in a patient above 4 kilos from coming to the cath lab for a PDA is significantly less. Less than 4 kilos has a much higher risk. I mean, we're talking in the 7 to 10% risk of something bad happening. Here it's less than 2% for an adverse outcome. So when I think of these patients, the very first thing I do, well, I get access. It's arterial and venous access always for these patients. It's usually a 5 French in the right femoral vein and then a 4 French in the right femoral artery. And the first thing I do is I take an aortic angiogram every single time. And I find this to be an extremely important first step to do. And the reason why I do this is you don't want to touch the PDA with a wire or a catheter and cause the PDA to have spasm. If your PDA has any spasm to it, you're going to undersize your device, because when you're measuring with your angiogram, you're measuring a smaller PDA than what it actually is. So the very first thing I do is I take my aortic angiogram, I take my measurements from that angiogram, and I pick my device right off the bat. And I never change that device, even if the PDA looks smaller after I cross it, because I think the PDA has spasmed and gotten smaller. So I do that first. After that, I do a right heart catheterization. I calculate QP-QS, I calculate what the patient's PVR is, I care what their mean PA pressure is, just to make sure they don't have irreversible pulmonary hypertension. As long as they have a normal pressure in their lungs and a normal PVR, I continue to go ahead with closing the PDA. I cross the PDA, I put a long sheath into the descending aorta, I take my wire out, and I put whatever device I've selected through that long sheath. I deploy the device or deliver the device. I don't release the device yet. I take an angiogram, I make sure that looks good, release the device, take another angiogram at the end, and then we're all done. Overall, 20, 30-minute procedure, not terribly long or terribly difficult, kind of our bread and butter pediatric interventional cardiology cases. This is just a case example of a recent one that we had. So these top two pictures here, it's not projecting terribly well, but if you trust me, I'll tell you that it's a really typical type A PDA, large aortic ampulla, and then it has your tapering into your PA. Uh-oh. Is there a way to, can you make this play again? Thank you. So you can see here we have our long delivery sheath in place. You can see I used an Amplatz duct occluder type 1 for this device, or for this PDA. And you can see that the duct occluder is sitting really nicely in the aortic ampulla. It has its typical tapering and narrowing to the PA side. You can still see flow going through the device, but you don't see any flow going around the device, which is important and what you want to see. And then we release the device, and you take your last picture, and again, you can see already the amount of flow going through the device has significantly decreased. By an hour or two later, these patients have no flow going through these devices. This device is a kind of a woven nitinol mesh that has some material inside it that, it takes an hour or so for it to clot, but after that, there's no flow going through this. Your PDA is gone. We keep our patients overnight in the hospital, but you don't necessarily need to. We do an x-ray after the case, and then we repeat an echo the next morning just to prove that the PDA is gone and our device is still in place. So let's move away from kind of the older patients. I think those are pretty standard, pretty bread and butter pediatric cases, and let's move to the premature PDAs because these are fun cases, these are nice to do, and we're doing a lot more of these in the US. These are our younger and smaller patients. A lot of centers in the US are keeping patients alive that are some centers are above 400 grams, up to 450 grams, and patients that are born as small as 22 weeks. And they're keeping these patients alive, and these patients have persistent PDAs. We know that. They're supposed to still have a PDA at that point. They weren't supposed to be born yet. They have a PDA. And what this does is it causes a large left to right shunt and a large volume burden on their lungs. And these patients have really sensitive, poorly developed lungs that aren't tolerating the extra volume burden of the PDA. So the Piccolo device is FDA approved down to 700 grams now in the States, and they're actually trying to get that smaller, to get that approved down to 500 grams, and that should probably happen in the near future. Other devices are being used. The KA plug and the microvascular plug are routinely used for closing premature PDA infants, which is also nice that we have options for different sizes. But what we've really found is these patients, it's more beneficial in the patients that were born less than 28 weeks. These are the patients that have PDAs that persist no matter what. You treat them with medicine using either ibuprofen, indomethacin, or Tylenol. Doesn't matter. The PDA is not going to go away. You need to do something to get rid of the PDA. Traditionally, you would do a surgical ligation, but I'm going to show you why that's not beneficial in this case, and why doing a transcatheter closure is more beneficial for these patients. These patients, they're on mechanical ventilation. Usually they're on some sort of positive pressure. They're on some sort of higher FiO2 requirement than they need to be. So being able to get that down and get them extubated, get them doing normal things is really important. The other thing that, when I talked about the older patients, is you see left heart enlargement. You don't see left heart enlargement in most of these patients. Most of these patients have a PFO still, or an ASD, and all the flow just goes to their left atrium and goes across their ASD. So you can't use left heart enlargement as your indication always in these cases. I'll show you a case, though, that did have left heart enlargement because the PDA was so significant. And then, what is a hemodynamically significant PDA? I don't know, and it's different from every center. So we get referrals from all around the state of Virginia. We have patients that come from 5-6 hours away because a neonatologist felt that that patient has a hemodynamically significant PDA and they should have it closed. I don't necessarily say yes or no, but if a neonatologist thinks so and refers to us, we are the tool to get the PDA closed, and then we go ahead and do it. So we have a really nice kind of multidisciplinary program at our institution that gets all the referrals from the state. We all sit down, we think about the patient, we look at the patient, and we say yes or no, and almost always we say yes. And then the patient gets transferred to our center, we close the PDA, and then we transfer them back to the referring center, hopefully within 2 or 3 days. So I think this is really important. This is from the Memphis group at Le Bonheur Children's. They do by far the most premature PDA closures of any center in the country. And what they show is these top 2 areas are, these are patients born less than 28 weeks. And you can see at day 10 of life, 50% of these patients still have a PDA. It doesn't matter if you've tried closing that PDA with medication, they will still have a persistent PDA at day 10 of life. And if you have it at day 10 of life, you can see that that pretty much persists up to about day 30 of life. Vast majority still have PDAs. So you got to do something to get rid of the PDA. And that could be a surgical ligation or a transcatheter closure. And obviously, I'm up here talking, so it's obviously going to be a transcatheter closure. So this is the reason why you need to do a transcatheter closure. So if you just look at the respiratory severity score, which I'll touch on the next slide, but if you look at the time it takes to change your respiratory severity score, and if you look at your transcatheter closure versus your surgical ligation, all of these patients have a clinically significant change in their respiratory severity score. They have time taken to return to their pre-procedure score also is statistically significant. They are extubated quicker, and the time to getting a respiratory severity score less than 1, meaning something that's appropriate for their age and their gestational age, is also clinically significant. All of those reasons, if you look at transcatheter closure versus surgical ligation, tells you you need to be doing this via transcatheter closure and not in the operating room. Also, our surgeons don't want to do these procedures, so we will gladly do them for them. Your respiratory severity score is your mean arterial pressure times your FiO2. Patients that have above a 2 on their respiratory severity score are in some sort of bad state. They're mechanically ventilated, they're getting higher FiO2 requirements than what they actually need. Your goal is to get those patients below 2. And what you can see here is that when you close your PDA, group 1 here, group 2, and group 3, but those patients that have their PDA closed less than 8 weeks of life do better quicker. If you close the PDA within 4 weeks of life, they do better even quicker. So closing these PDAs when these patients are young is very clinically relevant. You get them out of the hospital quicker, you get them extubated quicker, you get these patients moving through the NICU in a much quicker and safer fashion. So why do this? And this is the kind of the big thing. The Memphis data had 130 patients in this study, and they showed that patients with hemodynamically significant PDAs, we know they have a high mortality rate, and we know that they have high incidence of chronic lung disease, or BPD, bronchopulmonary dysplasia. And we want to reduce that because their long-term morbidity and mortality when you have chronic lung disease and morbidity and mortality is extremely high. So we want to shift those patients from either dying in the NICU or having severe BPD to a much lower risk BPD category, and that's exactly what they showed. So this graph is just a representation of what I was on the previous slide, but you can see here, death has gone down significantly. Patients with no BPD, no chronic lung disease, has gone up significantly. And your overall shift from patients here to patients here have shown that you are making patients better long term. Less patients will have chronic lung disease, less patients will die, and the severity of their chronic lung disease is better. So this is the fetal duct. This is the hockey stick type duct. Hockey stick meaning here's kind of where you're hitting the puck with, and then here's the shaft that you're grabbing. But all of these ducks have this kind of fetal appearance to them, across and then down, across and down. And this 10-4 position on your clock is really important for when you're placing these devices. So this is an example of an intraductal deployment of the Piccolo device. Any patient less than 2 kilograms needs to have an intraductal deployment of their device. It doesn't matter if it's a Piccolo or a Ka plug or a microvascular plug. Less than 2 kilos should be an intraductal deployment. And the reason why is you don't want to cause PA stenosis, LPA stenosis specifically, or aortic coarctation by having aortic stenosis. You can kind of see it's nice, again, that 10-4 appearance. This is what I'm looking for every time I'm placing one of these devices. This is just to kind of show why we want to do intraductal deployment in our less than 2 kilo kids. You can see here, if you are not intraductal, this is a nice intraductal approach here. But if you're not intraductal, you have risk of compressing and causing LPA stenosis from your PA side of your disc. Or if you're too far in the aorta, you can cause aortic obstruction and cause a coarctation at that point. I will say that aortic obstruction is by far my bigger worry. The LA obstruction, usually as long as the gradient is right around 2 to 2.5 meters per second, that's going to get better over time. There's been nice studies that have shown LPA stenosis or causing LPA stenosis in older patients doesn't actually have any clinical relevance, and it gets better. And that's kind of holding true for the pediatric or the premature population as well. So this is how I approach these cases. We do these cases in our cath lab. We have echo guidance for them, but we're doing this with predominantly echo guidance, but we do some angiography, you'll see. And we do some using our fluoroscopy as well. But there's definitely centers all around the country that are doing these at the bedside with only echo guidance. Our center is just not quite there yet, but hopefully we'll be there soon. Venous access only, 4 French, femoral vein, that's all you need. There's no arterial access. These kids are too small for arterial access unless you're trying to retrieve a device and something's gone wrong. You cross your PDA. I always use a 4 French glide catheter, and I use a woolly wire. That's my standard way of crossing the PDA. Other centers will use a 4 French glide catheter with a 035 glide wire is another way. Other places are also using a micro catheter inside your glide cath and an 014 wire. But I have found that with just a woolly wire, which has a nice soft tip, you're not going to damage anything, and a 4 French glide catheter, you can get through the right heart and get across the PDA in a really safe, easy fashion. Once you get to the descending aorta, we routinely put a small wire in and take our angiogram over the small wire just in case you cause spasm. That way you can cross back through the PDA. But you basically then take your wire out, you put your Piccolo delivery system, which goes through your 4 French sheath into the descending aorta. You do no sheath exchange during this procedure. And then you deliver your device using echo guidance usually. So you use echo guidance to make sure you haven't obstructed the aortic ampulla, and then you use echo guidance to help make sure that you're not obstructing the LPA side. Release your device, check again with echo, and then get out of there. So this is a case example of one of our preemie PDAs that we've done recently. So you can see large PDA. This kid had a large left heart, even to the point they had mitral regurgitation because of their left heart dilatation. So you know that this is a hemodynamically significant PDA. The referring center sent the patient up to us. Patient came, we did this echo. The next day we brought them to the cath lab to close the PDA. You can see we try to get nice 2D measurements. You're in your color compare here, but you can see the PDA measures about 9 millimeters in length. Maximum dimension is 3 millimeters. And we brought him to the cath lab. We did our normal approach here. You can see really typical fetal PDA type here. You can see good sized PAs, and you can see no evidence. You don't see any reflux into the ascending aorta, but you see the descending aorta nicely here. These were the measurements in the cath lab from the angiogram. So you can see a little bit different from measurements, a little bit more length to the device or to the PDA, and a little bit larger in diameter, 3.3 millimeters. So these charts here are from the IFU for the Piccolo device. These aren't necessarily the charts I'm currently using. There'll be an updated IFU that comes out in the next probably 6 to 8 months or so. But these are what the IFU says. So if you're less than 2 kilos, or sorry, greater than 2 kilos, you're using this chart. And if you're less than 2 kilos, you're using this chart. And you basically just take your measurements and you pick your device based off of what they say in their IFU. So you can see here we have our device deployed. We did take a PA angiogram in this case, which we don't always do, but that's a nice case example to show you that the PAs are unobstructed. You can see nice flow to both your LPA and your RPA, but you get that 10-4 appearance, and that 10-4 appearance is really important. I think I've said it many times, 10-4. If you know you're in that 10-4 position and you on echo have no aortic compression, your device is going to sit intraductal and it's going to be in a nice position. So when you release this device, it's going to fall just a little bit towards the PA side, but we know because of an angiogram, we know that our PAs are nice and wide open here. Here's our echo at the time. We haven't released the device yet. You can see your aorta here through the sweep. It looks like the device is hanging out in the aorta, but it's just overlay. You're just getting some reflection from the device. And you can see here that you have nice unobstructed aortic flow. You're not causing any aortic obstruction. We've released the device. We like the position. And you can see here, the device has fallen a little bit. You're still in that 10-4 position, but the device, the PA side has fallen down a little bit towards the PA. We were a little worried, so we took a picture, but you can see the PA is nice and wide open. This was actually at the case, after we had released it. It's not the greatest picture of the LPA flow, but there's unobstructed LPA flow through here. So that patient, I believe that patient was extubated the next morning. I believe they were back onto their non-invasive. I think they were on CPAP of something. They basically went home or got transferred back to the referring center 2 days later. And we have basically different follow-up strategies, but the outside hospital continues to follow them as they advance through the NICU and get discharged. Just really briefly, some complications from PDA closures. So obviously device embolization is important. I think I touched on that. You take that aortic angiogram beforehand so that you don't have device embolization. You're not undersizing your device. And I think the updated IFU that the Amplatzer Piccolo company is going to come out with is actually going to be very helpful for not undersizing premature PDA devices anymore. Residual shunts, those are pretty rare. We take angiograms or use echo to make sure that there's not residual shunts. Aortic and pulmonary obstruction, we talked about a bunch. And then endocarditis risk. So even though it's an endocarditis risk to have a PDA, the first 6 months after your PDA device has been deployed is also an endocarditis risk. So we really stress making sure these patients have clean teeth, that their teeth have been checked by a dentist before coming to the cath lab. We give them a dose of antibiotics in the cath lab. And then for the next 6 months after the procedure, we have those patients get a dose of antibiotics if they are going to the dentist. After 6 months, the device is completely endothelialized, and the endocarditis risk from the device has gone down to virtually nothing, so we stop the antibiotic prophylaxis at that point. And I believe that's all I have. This is just the rest of our cath team. Mike Hainstock and then Scott Lim are the other pediatric cath docs that we work with. Thank you, guys.